What happens when the ultimate punishment turns into the ultimate disaster? All throughout history, executions were meant to be swift, final, and terrifying enough to keep others in line. They weren't just punishments. They were public performances, carefully staged to remind everyone who held the power. One clean stroke, one calculated drop, one instant of silence, and it was over. At least that was the plan. But sometimes, those plans went horribly, almost unbelievably wrong. Imagine standing in a medieval courtyard, expecting a quick, clean beheading, only to watch the executioner miss again and again, turning what should have been a grim ceremony into a nightmare no one could unsee. Or picture yourself at the debut of the humane electric chair, only to be trapped in a room filling with smoke and the sickening smell of burning flesh. These moments didn't just horrify the spectators, they often forced entire societies to rethink the way executions were carried out. And in some cases, they sparked the very reforms that eventually ended public executions altogether. Let's start with one of the most infamous failures, the axe that simply couldn't do its job. In 1541, Margaret Pole, 67 years old, and one of the last living members of the Plantagenet dynasty, was condemned for treason under Henry VIII. On paper, her execution was supposed to be straightforward. Noblewoman brought to the block, one decisive blow, the end. But that's not what happened. The usual executioner reportedly refused to kill an elderly woman of noble blood, and so a replacement was brought in, an amateur, possibly even a volunteer pulled from the crowd. You can already see where this is going. When told to place her head on the block, Margaret is said to have replied, "So should traitors do, and I am none." She resisted, refusing to cooperate. Already nervous, the inexperienced executioner swung his axe and missed, completely. Instead of her neck, he struck the back of her head. Blood streamed down her face. Margaret, in a panic, leapt from the block and ran across the scaffold. What followed was like a gruesome parody of justice. The executioner chased her across the platform, hacking wildly, striking her shoulders, her arms, her back, anywhere but her neck. Witnesses claimed he struck her at least 11 times before she finally collapsed, her body giving out from blood loss. The spectators, who had come expecting one quick blow, were left shaken and horrified. Some vomited, others fled. Even hardened Tudor courtiers described it as barbaric beyond belief. And yet, as horrific as Margaret Pole's execution was, it wasn't the worst of its kind. That grim title arguably belongs to Mary, Queen of Scots. Fast forward to 1587. After years of imprisonment, Elizabeth I finally ordered Mary's death. Her execution was meant to be not only precise but symbolic, a cold display of English justice carried out with royal efficiency. But what the crowd saw that day was chaos. The executioner swung his axe and missed. Instead of cleanly severing her neck, the blade struck the back of Mary's head. She let out a low groan, a sound that echoed through the great hall. Panic set in. The executioner raised his axe again and struck harder. This time, he nearly severed the head, but tendons and skin still held it in place. It took a third blow, smaller, almost hesitant, to finally finish the job. But even then, the nightmare wasn't over. As was tradition, the executioner grabbed the head by the hair lifted it high, and shouted, "God save the Queen!" The hall went silent. Then, to everyone's horror, the head slipped from his hands. Not because he dropped it, but because Mary had been wearing a wig. The wig tore free, and her severed head, gray and balding, tumbled across the floor. Witnesses swore her lips continued to move, as if muttering prayers even in death. The silence shattered into screams. The dean leading prayers stopped mid-sentence, staring in shock. The crowd, expecting solemn justice, instead witnessed grotesque theater. These two bungled executions left lasting marks on history. Margaret Pole's botched death led to stricter standards for training executioners. Mary's execution, meanwhile, helped fuel opposition to public executions among the nobility, many of whom saw firsthand how quickly justice could collapse into horror. But axes weren't the only tools that failed. Sometimes the stage itself betrayed its purpose. In 1498, Florence prepared for the execution of Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery monk who had convinced citizens to burn their art, books, and luxuries in his infamous bonfire of the vanities. His own execution was supposed to be poetic justice, a grand public burning in the same square where he'd once rallied crowds. A massive wooden platform was built in Florence's Piazza della Signoria. Thousands gathered, waiting for the flames to consume him. But the moment he was tied to the stake, disaster struck. The platform collapsed. Not splinter by splinter, completely, all at once. Savonarola and two fellow monks, still tied to their posts, came crashing down in a heap of wood and kindling. The square erupted, not in cheers, but in stunned silence. Executions were supposed to demonstrate order and control, the steady hand of justice. Instead, the scene looked more like slapstick chaos. Officials scrambled, unsure what to do. Do they rebuild? Do they stop? Eventually, they decided to improvise. The wreckage was rearranged. The crown had made Ivan powerful, but power alone did not soothe the shadows that lingered in his heart. From his earliest years, he had lived with betrayal as a constant companion. And when he looked upon his court, he saw not allies, but traitors in waiting. The boy who had once been abandoned by his caretakers now ruled as a man who trusted no one. And in that absence of trust, something monstrous began to grow. At first, Ivan had tried to strengthen his realm with reforms. He had summoned the nobility, reorganized the army, even gave voice to councils that allowed boyars to advise him. For a brief moment, it seemed he might become a ruler of wisdom, a czar who would lift his people higher. Yet suspicion gnawed at him with every whisper that reached his ears. If a noble delayed in offering counsel, Ivan believed it was treason. If a general returned from battle with less than complete victory, Ivan saw betrayal. To him, hesitation was a mask for treachery, and silence was nothing less than conspiracy. Then came the turning point. The death of his beloved wife, Anastasia. She had been his anchor, the only soul who could calm the storms within him. When she suddenly sickened and died, Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned. Whether truth or paranoia, the loss shattered the last fragile thread of trust he held. From that day forward, the Tsar, who might have been remembered as a reformer, gave himself over fully to suspicion and vengeance. It was then that Ivan created the Oprichnina, a state within a state, a dark domain where his word was law and his enforcers answered only to him. These enforcers, known as the oprichniki, were not ordinary guards. Dressed in black, they carried severed dog heads and broomsticks on their saddles. The dog heads, they said, were to sniff out treason, while the brooms were to sweep betrayal from the land. They rode through villages like specters of death, their arrival a sign that suspicion had already taken root. To the people, the oprichniki were not men, but nightmares. They tortured boyars, burned estates, slaughtered families, and left towns in smoldering ruin. Their cruelty was theatrical, designed not only to punish, but to terrify. Under their watch, fear replaced loyalty, silence replaced speech, and the land itself seemed to grow darker. Ivan had given himself an army of wolves, yet he remained unsatisfied. The more blood spilled, the more convinced he became that traitors still lurked in every shadow. When an entire city fell under suspicion, Novgorod, proud and ancient, he unleashed the full force of his wrath. He accused its people of conspiring with foreign enemies and ordered his oprichniki to make an example of them. What followed was a massacre so savage that the city never recovered. Men, women, and children were dragged into icy rivers, beaten in the streets, executed without trial. The cries of Novgorod became a scar upon the land, a wound that bled for generations. Yet to Ivan, this was justice. Each act of violence confirmed his belief that he was chosen by God to purge the unfaithful. The Tsar, who once dreamed of reform, now cloaked himself in the armor of divine destiny. But what he called divine judgment, his people knew only as terror. It was during these years that Ivan became truly terrible, not merely in name, but in essence. His kingdom was transformed into a stage for cruelty, his throne into a seat of paranoia, and though the oprichniki carried out his will, the true monster was the hand that guided them. Ivan had forged an empire of fear, but in doing so he chained himself to that same fear. The boy abandoned long ago had grown into a ruler who could never escape the shadows. As Ivan's reign of terror continued, the line between justice and cruelty blurred entirely. No noble was safe, no city immune. Even whispers of dissent became proof of conspiracy, and the oprichniki, his black-clad agents of fear, moved like shadows across the land, rooting out supposed traitors with ruthless efficiency. Yet with every act of violence, the monster Ivan had created began to consume him as well. His paranoia became a prison, each decision heavier than the last, until the Tsar, who once sought to control his kingdom, found himself enslaved by his own suspicion. The terror of Ivan's rule was not limited to the nobility. Ordinary people lived in constant dread. Merchants hid their wealth, peasants fled the countryside, and villages learned that to survive, silence was their only protection. No one knew when the oprichniki might arrive, or why. The punishment was swift, brutal, and final. Houses burned, livestock slaughtered, families torn apart, all as a warning to others that betrayal would not be tolerated. It was a theater of fear where the actors had no choice but to play their roles perfectly, for misstep could mean death. But fear alone could not satisfy Ivan. He demanded spectacle. The executions and punishments were orchestrated not just as deterrents, but as twisted forms of entertainment. Public displays of brutality served as lessons in obedience. Yet for the Tsar, they also reinforced his belief in his own divine authority. He was God's instrument, wielding punishment with absolute certainty. And yet, the more he exercised power, the more isolated he became. Trusted allies vanished, fled, or were executed, leaving only echoes of loyalty, shadows of truth. One of the most infamous acts of Ivan's reign was the massacre of Novgorod. Convinced that the city's leaders were plotting against him, he ordered the oprichniki to descend like a plague. For days, the streets ran with blood. Citizens were dragged from their homes, tortured, and killed. Entire families were destroyed, and the once prosperous city was left in smoldering ruin. Ivan's anger, fueled by paranoia, had transformed into a ritual of annihilation. And yet, to him, it was righteous justice, an essential cleansing of betrayal. Even his inner circle was not spared. Boyars, those who had once wielded influence over the kingdom, became targets. Their estates were confiscated or burned, their children imprisoned, and their lives ended in unspeakable ways. In Ivan's mind, fear ensured obedience, and obedience preserved his throne. But the cost was immense. The kingdom trembled not under foreign threat, but under the weight of its own terrorized population. Trust, once the foundation of governance, had crumbled, replaced entirely by fear and suspicion. As Ivan aged, the effects of his cruelty became even more apparent. The man who had once ruled with sharp intellect now appeared haunted by the blood on his hands, the screams of the innocent, and the endless shadow of betrayal he imagined everywhere. Even his closest advisors approached him cautiously, aware that a single misstep could bring them to the scaffold. The oprichniki, once tools of terror, had become extensions of his paranoia, reporting imagined conspiracies, exaggerating minor offenses, feeding the cycle of fear. By the end of Ivan's reign, the Tsardom of Russia had been reshaped into a kingdom of shadows. The people had learned to survive through silence and obedience, but at a terrible cost. The very soul of the nation had been scarred. Historians would later look back on Ivan's rule as a chilling example of how absolute power, unchecked and fueled by fear, can give birth to monsters. And perhaps most haunting of all, the ultimate tragedy of Ivan's life was not merely the destruction of his enemies, but the transformation of himself. In creating monsters to serve his will, he had become one himself, feared, isolated, and consumed by the very darkness he had unleashed. History remembers Ivan the Terrible not just for the terror he spread, but for the lesson his reign offers. That when suspicion overtakes justice and cruelty is mistaken for power, even the strongest ruler becomes a prisoner of their own tyranny. The oprichniki, the massacres, the endless cycle of fear, these were not just acts of governance, but mirrors reflecting the darkness within Ivan's own heart. And in that reflection, one sees the ultimate truth of his legacy. Sometimes, the monster is not who we hunt, but who we allow ourselves to become.